Somewhere off the Atlantic coast of the United States right now, a cargo ship or a fishing vessel is crossing paths with one of the rarest large animals on the planet, and there is a real chance neither the crew nor the whale will know it happened until it's too late. As of the most recent federal count, only 384 North Atlantic right whales remain alive anywhere on Earth, and of those, only around 70 are reproductively active females, the animals whose survival actually determines whether the species has a future at all. What almost drove this whale to extinction a century ago was harpoons. What is still killing it today is something far more mundane, and the government agency responsible for stopping it just proposed a rule change that has conservation scientists deeply alarmed. Every claim in this video is drawn from official reports and rulemaking documents published by NOAA Fisheries, population estimates from the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium, and the agency's own Federal Register notices. This is not the simplified version of the right whale story. This is what the actual data and the actual regulatory record show right now. To understand why federal regulators are even discussing ship speeds around this particular whale, you first have to understand how the species got its name in the first place, and it is not a flattering origin. Whalers in the 18th and 19th centuries called this species the right whale, because it was, quite literally, the right whale to hunt. It swims slowly. It feeds close to the surface near shore, putting it directly in the path of ships and fishing boats. And, critically, its body is so thick with blubber that a dead right whale floats instead of sinking, which meant whalers could tow the carcass back to shore rather than losing it to the depths. Those same traits that made the species easy prey for over a century of commercial whaling are, disturbingly, the exact same traits that make it easy to accidentally kill today. By the time international protections began in 1935, whaling had already pushed the North Atlantic right whale to the edge of extinction, and unlike some other great whale species that rebounded significantly after hunting stopped, right whales never really recovered their numbers. For most of the 20th century, the population hovered in the low hundreds, propped up by nothing more than the absence of active hunting. What has kept the species pinned near extinction for the past several decades has nothing to do with harpoons at all. North Atlantic right whales migrate along one of the most heavily trafficked stretches of ocean in the world, the same shipping lanes, fishing grounds, and coastal waters used by one of the busiest maritime economies on the planet, running from their calving grounds off Georgia and Florida up to feeding grounds off New England and Canada. Biologists sometimes call it the urban whale, a species forced to share its entire migratory range with cargo ships, tankers, cruise liners, and thousands of commercial and recreational fishing vessels. The two things now killing right whales faster than they can reproduce are vessel strikes, being hit by ships, and entanglement in fishing gear, primarily the vertical ropes connecting lobster and crab traps on the seafloor to buoys on the surface. In 2017, the die-off had become severe enough that NOAA formally declared an unusual mortality event, a designation reserved for significant, unexplained spikes in marine mammal deaths that demand an emergency response. The regulatory response to the vessel strike half of that problem dates back to 2008, when NOAA Fisheries implemented mandatory seasonal speed restrictions in specific coastal zones called seasonal management areas, requiring most vessels 65 feet or longer to slow to 10 knots or less at certain times of year when whales were known to be present. The logic is straightforward and well supported by research. A ship moving at 10 knots or slower is dramatically less likely to kill a whale it hits than one moving at full cruising speed, and slower speeds give both whales and crews more time to react and avoid a collision entirely. For over a decade, that rule represented the primary legal tool protecting right whales from ship traffic. By the numbers, the rule has clearly helped, but it has not come close to solving the problem. NOAA's own records show at least 12 documented lethal vessel strikes on right whales in U.S. waters since the speed rule went into effect, and vessels under 65 feet, boats too small to be covered by the original mandatory rule, account for 5 of those 12 deaths. In just the 2.5 years leading up to late 2025, NOAA documented at least 4 additional lethal or seriously injurious vessel strikes. Compliance with the existing rule has also been inconsistent. Federal monitoring dating back to 2021 found speed restrictions were being widely ignored in some regions, with the lowest compliance rates recorded off the southeastern coast, precisely where the whales' calving grounds overlap with rapidly growing port traffic and coastal development. Vessel strikes are only half of what's driving this species toward extinction, and the other half may be even harder to fix. Right whales feed by swimming slowly through the water with their enormous mouths open, filtering thousands of tiny zooplankton, which makes them especially prone to swimming directly into the vertical ropes that connect lobster and crab traps on the seafloor to buoys floating on the surface. Researchers who study entanglement scarring, essentially reading the marks left on a whale's body the way you'd read a medical history, estimate that somewhere between 85 and 87% of living North Atlantic right whales carry visible scars from at least one entanglement, and that more than half have been entangled multiple times, with some individual whales showing evidence of 8 or 9 separate entanglement events over their lifetime. A whale that survives an entanglement doesn't necessarily escape unharmed. Trailing rope can slice into skin and blubber over months, cause chronic infection, make normal feeding difficult, and in females, has been linked to lower birth rates even years after the animal appears to have freed itself. In response, fishery managers and NOAA have spent years developing what's sometimes called ropeless or on-demand gear, traps that sit on the seafloor without any permanent vertical line to the surface, using a remote acoustic signal to release a buoy only when a fisherman is ready to haul the trap in. The technology works, but rolling it out across an entire commercial lobster and crab fishing industry, retraining fishers and replacing standard gear at scale, has been slow, expensive, and, like the speed rule itself, politically contested. In response to these gaps, NOAA proposed a significantly expanded version of the speed rule back in 2022, one that would have broadened the size, timing, and geographic footprint of mandatory slow zones and, for the first time, applied speed restrictions to most vessels between 35 and 65 feet, a category that includes a large share of the recreational and charter fishing fleet along the East Coast. That proposal ran directly into a wall of organized opposition. Boating and recreational fishing groups, including the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation and a coalition called the Whale and Vessel Safety Task Force, argued the expanded rule was based on flawed risk modeling, pointing out that NOAA's own technical documents acknowledge the whale density estimates used for parts of the mid-Atlantic coast might not be realistic. They calculated that, based on millions of recorded recreational fishing trips since 2008, a boat in that 35 to 65-foot range faced less than a 1 in a million chance of ever striking a right whale, and argued the economic cost to coastal fishing communities and marine businesses was disproportionate to that risk. The expanded 2022 proposal never got finalized. It sat in regulatory limbo for years. And now the story has taken a turn that would have seemed almost unbelievable if you'd predicted it in 2022. In March of 2026, NOAA Fisheries published a notice announcing it is now considering the opposite move entirely, a deregulatory action to modify and, in the agency's own words, modernize the existing speed rule, potentially replacing the current seasonal speed zones with alternative management areas and newer technology-based strike avoidance tools instead of blanket mandatory slowdowns. The stated goal is reducing what the agency calls unnecessary regulatory and economic burden on the shipping and boating industries. Here's what makes the timing genuinely strange. This reconsideration is happening at almost the exact moment the population has finally shown its first real signs of stabilizing. The 2025 count of roughly 384 whales marks the third consecutive year the population estimate has ticked upward, an increase of about 20 animals since the low point around 2020. Conservation scientists have been blunt about what they think a weakened rule would mean for that fragile trend. One senior scientist involved in right whale advocacy put it directly, warning that loosening the speed rule now would put the species back on what she called the fast track to extinction, arguing that in the specific times and places where right whales are most at risk, the science is simple: ships need to slow down, regardless of the cost to industry. Which puts this story at a genuinely unresolved fork, one where reasonable people looking at the same numbers land in very different places. Do you weigh the documented, repeatedly measured biological benefit of slower ship speeds for a species with only about 70 breeding females left on the planet? Or do you weigh the real economic burden on fishing families and coastal businesses who point out that their own individual boats have an extremely low statistical chance of ever encountering, let alone striking, one of fewer than 400 whales spread across an entire ocean? NOAA is currently accepting public comment on exactly this question, with a deadline in June of 2026. And as of this video, no one knows which way the agency will ultimately land. What isn't up for debate is the raw math of extinction risk. Right whales are long-lived and reproduce slowly, typically producing a single calf only once every several years, which means a population this small cannot simply breed its way back from a bad year of ship strikes and entanglements, the way a faster reproducing species might. Every single one of the roughly 70 reproductively active females currently alive represents an outsized share of the species' entire future. And losing even a handful of them to preventable vessel collisions could erase years of slow, hard-won population gains in a single bad season. Nearly a century after the world stopped illegally killing right whales on purpose, the species that whalers once called easy to hunt turned out to be just as easy to accidentally kill by other means. And the regulatory fight over how much that should cost the shipping and fishing industries is still being argued out in real time, in federal comment periods, right now, while the whales themselves keep swimming through exactly the same crowded waters they always have. Maybe that's the uncomfortable core of this particular recovery story. It was never really about whether people could stop hunting a species on purpose. It's about whether an economy built entirely around fast, efficient movement through the ocean is willing to slow down, even a little. For an animal that has no way of knowing, the rules keep changing above the surface it swims just beneath.